I just wanted to ask about a parking permit. Her assistant laughed in my face instead. Boy, this ain't your neighborhood, she sneered. I stayed calm. 3 years passed since that humiliating afternoon. Then the county sent her a letter. The name on the deed shocked everyone. It was mine. My name is Marcus Reed. And for most of my life I have been underestimated the moment I walk into a room. I grew up in a small rental apartment in Cleveland, the son of a nurse and a mechanic, and I learned early that people see what they expect to see, not what's actually standing in front of them. By 34, I had built a logistics software company from a garage into a firm with clients across the Midwest. I moved my wife, Dana, and our 2 kids into Brookhaven Estates, a gated community outside Columbus, because I wanted my children to grow up somewhere quiet, safe, and green. Brookhaven had a reputation before I ever signed the closing papers. Neighbors joked that the HOA newsletter read like a legal threat wrapped in floral stationery. At the center of it all sat Karen Whitfield, HOA president for 11 straight years, a woman who treated the community bylaws like personal scripture. Karen ran Brookhaven from a corner office in the clubhouse, flanked by a rotating cast of assistants who answered to her before they answered to their own names. She had opinions about everyone's lawn height, everyone's mailbox paint, and especially everyone's cars parked in the wrong direction. I met her for the first time at a welcome meeting, where she looked me up and down like she was pricing a used appliance. Reed, she repeated slowly, glancing at my modest sedan in the parking lot. I hope you read the covenants closely. We have standards here. I let it go. New personalities. And I told myself Karen was simply thorough, maybe overzealous. Nothing more. Dana wasn't so sure. She'd noticed the way Karen's smile never reached her eyes whenever our family walked past her manicured hedge on Sycamore Lane. Word around the neighborhood was that Karen had run off 2 other families in the past 5 years, both of them the only black homeowners on their respective streets, each time citing some obscure violation nobody else got fined for. Nobody could prove intent. Karen was careful. Her right hand was a young woman named Brittany Voss, 26, sharp-tongued, always dressed like she worked somewhere far more important than a suburban clubhouse. Brittany handled violation notices, parking permits, and the front desk, and she mirrored Karen's contempt with an energy all her own. I kept my head down that first year. I paid my dues on time, mowed my lawn on schedule, and avoided the clubhouse whenever possible. My business was thriving quietly. I just closed a contract that would eventually let me expand into 3 new states, though nobody at Brookhaven knew that yet. On weekends I liked to visit dealerships, not always to buy, but to study engineering, something left over from my mechanic father's garage lessons. That particular Saturday, I'd heard through a client that a rare Bentley Continental GT had been traded in locally, and curiosity got the better of me. The dealership sat 2 miles from Brookhaven, right past the intersection where the community's shuttle service dropped residents for errands. I decided to walk the short stretch that morning, dressed down in a plain t-shirt and jeans, because it was hot and I wasn't trying to impress anybody. On my way back, I stopped by the clubhouse to ask about a temporary parking pass for my brother, who was visiting the following week and needed somewhere to park his rental car without getting towed. It seemed like the simplest errand in the world. What I didn't know yet was that Karen had spent that entire morning fuming over a different matter entirely. An anonymous letter to the county zoning board questioning some renovations at her own house. Renovations that, as I'd later learn, were far from properly permitted. She was in a mood before I ever walked through that clubhouse door, primed to take her frustration out on the first inconvenient face she saw. Unfortunately for both of us, that face was mine, and the timing could not have been worse. Brittany was at the front desk scrolling her phone when I walked in, still catching my breath from the dealership visit, mentioning offhand to another resident in line that I'd just been looking at, that Bentley over on Route 9. Gorgeous car. The resident, an older man named Frank, nodded politely, but Brittany's head snapped up like she'd heard something scandalous. She looked at my t-shirt, my sneakers, the sweat on my brow from the walk, and something in her expression shifted into open suspicion. "A Bentley?" she repeated, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, drawing out the word like it was a punchline. I didn't think much of it yet. I simply smiled, stepped up to the counter, and asked about the visitor parking pass for my brother. "You're asking about a parking pass," Brittany said, smirking. "But you were just drooling over a Bentley?" "Sure you were." Couple heads turned. I felt heat creep up my neck. Not from embarrassment, but from the particular anger of being disbelieved for no reason at all. "I wasn't drooling," I said evenly. "I was checking the engineering. My father was a mechanic. I like cars." Brittany rolled her eyes theatrically, glancing toward the back office where Karen's silhouette had just appeared in the doorway. Drawn by the rising volume, Karen strolled up with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned the room, arms crossed, eyeing me the way she might eye a stray dog that wandered onto her porch. "Is there a problem, Brittany?" she asked, though her focus never left me. "He's asking about a Bentley," Brittany said with a laugh, as if that single sentence explained everything. Karen's mouth curled into something between amusement and disdain. "Sweetheart," she said to me, "this isn't a car we're going to help you finance. This is a homeowners association." The insult landed exactly as intended. 3 other residents in the lobby went quiet, pretending to study the community bulletin board. I felt my pulse quicken, that old familiar burn of being reduced to a punchline in front of strangers. But I kept my voice level. "I own a home here," I said. "Unit 214 on Sycamore. I'm here about a parking pass for a family visit. Not a car loan." Karen's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of recalculation crossing her face, though her tone didn't soften one bit. 214 Sycamore, she repeated, tapping something into her desktop, her nails clicking against the keys with theatrical precision. "That's the smaller lot section, isn't it?" Strange. As someone who'd be looking at Bentleys, "Dear, maybe you misheard the price." Brittany snickered again, covering her mouth like she was watching a comedy sketch instead of insulting a paying homeowner. Frank, the older resident still waiting behind me, shifted uncomfortably, clearly noticing the tone but saying nothing, the way people often do when it's not their fight. "I know exactly what it cost," I replied quietly. "I wasn't buying it for myself anyway. I was checking on it for a client." That detail, true as it was, meant nothing to Karen. To her, my shirt and my shoes had already delivered the verdict. "Of course you were," Karen said. her smile sugar-sweet and razor-edged. "Well, dear, the parking pass form is on the counter. Fill it out completely this time. Some of you people don't read instructions very well." The word "you people" hit the room like a dropped glass. Frank actually flinched. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not rage exactly, but a clarifying certainty. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was a pattern she'd perfected over years, dressed up as HOA professionalism, aimed at anyone who didn't fit her picture of who belonged. I filled out the form in silence, my jaw tight, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a scene. Brittany watched me the entire time like she expected me to fumble the pen, murmuring something to Karen I couldn't quite hear, followed by both women laughing. I turned the form in, said nothing further, and walked out of that clubhouse with my ears ringing. Dana asked why I looked so tense when I got home, and when I told her, her face went hard in a way I rarely saw. "That's the same thing they did to the Okafors before they sold," Dana said quietly, referencing the family 2 streets over who'd left Brookhaven abruptly 2 summers back after months of selective fines. I hadn't put it together until she said it out loud. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of anger alone, but because something about Karen's confidence bothered me. The ease with which she humiliated a homeowner in public. Certain there would be no consequences. Certain the community would simply nod along as always. I began quietly asking around. A neighbor named Priya mentioned Karen had been under a cloud of murmurs about missing landscaping funds for over a year, though nobody had proof, and the HOA board rotated so slowly that Karen effectively controlled every vote that mattered. Another neighbor, a retired accountant named Walter, told me flatly that he'd stopped attending HOA meetings because arguing with Karen Whitfield is like arguing with a brick wall wearing pearls. Everyone had a story. Nobody had done anything about it. I decided that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, that I wasn't going to be another quiet departure from Brookhaven. If Karen wanted a fight dressed up as bylaws, I would learn every single one of those bylaws better than she did. The following Monday, I requested Brookhaven's full financial disclosures, a right every homeowner technically held under the association's own charter, though almost nobody ever exercised it. Brittany handed me the request form with visible irritation, muttering that most people don't bother with all this. 3 days later, I received a curt email stating the financial records were currently under review and would be released at the board's discretion. I forwarded the email to a lawyer friend, Renee, who specialized in HOA disputes, and immediately flagged the response as a stall tactic. Renee explained that Ohio law required disclosure within a set window regardless of board discretion, and that Karen's response, if repeated, could constitute a violation worth reporting to the state's Consumer Protection Division. I filed that fact away carefully, like a tool I wasn't ready to use yet. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to have decided I was now a target worth watching. Within 2 weeks, I received my first violation notice, an $85 fine for unauthorized vehicle storage, referring to my father-in-law's old pickup truck parked in my own driveway for exactly 1 weekend. I checked the bylaws Renee had sent me. The rule cited a 72-hour limit, and the truck had been there for 40 hours. I photographed the empty driveway, time-stamped it, and submitted a formal appeal, attaching every relevant bylaw clause Karen herself had signed off on. The appeal vanished into silence for 3 weeks. When I finally called the clubhouse, Brittany answered, informing me flatly that The board already voted to uphold the fine. No meeting had been scheduled. No vote had occurred. I knew because I'd checked the posted minutes myself. I brought this discrepancy to a board meeting in person. Standing at the podium during public comment. Watching Karen's face flicker with mild surprise that I'd actually shown up prepared with printed bylaws and time-stamped photos instead of simply paying the fine quietly like everyone else did. "Mr." Karen said smoothly to the room, "We appreciate residents who care about following the rules." She said it like a compliment, but her eyes said something else entirely. A warning that I was making myself inconvenient, and inconvenient people at Brookhaven tended to regret it. The fine was quietly waived after the meeting. A small, almost meaningless victory, but it told me something valuable. Karen didn't like being watched. She operated best in the dark, in unchallenged assumptions, in homeowners too tired or too polite to push back against her. 2 other residents approached me afterward in the parking lot. A young couple, the Delgados, who admitted they'd been fined for a loud home renovation that never actually violated any noise ordinance. They'd paid quietly, afraid of retaliation. Exactly the reaction Karen counted on from everyone. I started keeping a private folder on my laptop, labeled simply Brookhaven, where I logged every strange incident, every inconsistent fine, every resident's whispered complaint. It wasn't a plan yet. Not exactly. Just documentation. The same instinct that had built my company from nothing. Dana worried I was letting this consume me. "You don't have to be the one who fixes this neighborhood," she said one evening, watching me cross-reference violation notices against the official bylaws PDF at midnight. I told her I wasn't trying to fix Brookhaven. I was protecting my family. The following month brought a second incident, sharper than the first. My son Elijah, 12 years old, was stopped by clubhouse security while walking home from the community pool, questioned about loitering near unauthorized property. Despite carrying his own key fob and living 4 houses down, Elijah came home shaken, asking me why the guard kept asking if he lived here for real. I called the security company directly, learned the guard had been specifically instructed by Karen's office to monitor unfamiliar faces near the clubhouse more closely after some unspecified incident. When I asked what incident had prompted this new instruction, nobody could give me a straight answer. The timing, though, was unmistakable, barely 3 weeks after my confrontation at the board meeting. I filed a formal complaint with the security company's regional office that same night. Karen, when confronted by phone about the new monitoring policy, insisted it was purely about general safety and had nothing to do with any particular family. Her voice carried that same practiced sweetness, the kind designed to sound reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. I began recording every phone call after that, legally, with the required disclosure, a habit Renee had recommended given the pattern forming. Karen never suspected a homeowner she considered beneath her notice would think to build a case as carefully as she built her fines. Brittany, meanwhile, grew bolder in her comments whenever I visited the clubhouse, once asking loudly in front of other residents whether my internet business was legitimate, a question with no basis except my skin color and the modest car I still drove despite my growing income. I didn't correct her assumption about my finances. Not yet. In being underestimated. A lesson my father had taught me back in his garage. Let people believe what makes them comfortable, and use the gap between their belief and reality when it counts most. A retired schoolteacher named Gloria pulled me aside one afternoon near the mailboxes, whispering that she'd overheard Karen on the phone with someone from the property management company discussing problem residents by name. My name apparently included on whatever list Karen kept. Gloria's information matched something Renee had warned me about. Some HOA presidents kept informal blacklists used to justify selective enforcement. Technically illegal but nearly impossible to prove without insider documentation. I thanked Gloria and added her account, carefully dated, to my growing folder. Around this time, I learned through a passing conversation with Frank that Karen's own home renovation, the one connected to that anonymous zoning complaint months earlier, had in fact been completed without a proper permit. A violation that would normally trigger immediate fines under her own bylaws. The hypocrisy stung more than the fines themselves. Karen enforced rules with ruthless precision against residents she disliked, while conveniently overlooking identical violations in her own backyard, protected by a board too intimidated or too loyal to ever hold her accountable for anything. I requested county zoning records on Karen's property through public information channels, a completely legal step any citizen could take. The records confirmed what Frank suspected, an addition built without permits, structurally questionable, sitting quietly for 3 years without a single HOA fine attached. I didn't act on this information immediately. Renee advised patience, explaining that a single piece of leverage used too early loses its power. Let her keep making mistakes, Renee said. People like this always escalate. You want her at her worst when you finally move. That advice proved wiser than either of us expected. Karen's behavior over the following weeks grew visibly more erratic, as though some deeper pressure was building beneath her polished exterior, something beyond her usual petty enforcement, something closer to genuine desperation. I later learned, through Priya, that the HOA's reserve fund audit had been quietly delayed twice that quarter, a red flag any experienced business owner recognizes instantly. Delayed audits rarely mean paperwork problems. They usually mean someone doesn't want the numbers examined too closely. I mentioned this observation to Renee, who lit up immediately. If she's been dipping into reserves, Renee said, that's not just an HOA violation. Depending on the amount, that's potential embezzlement. And that's not something a board apology fixes. The stakes had just changed entirely. I began attending every board meeting after that. No longer as a frustrated homeowner, but as a quiet, deliberate observer, tracking every budget line item Karen presented, cross-referencing her verbal explanations against the sparse financial summaries the board occasionally released to residents. Karen noticed my consistent presence and didn't like it. She started addressing questions from other residents more sharply, visibly rattled whenever anyone asked about landscaping costs that seemed to balloon year after year despite the same vendor supposedly providing the same modest services. One meeting, she snapped at an elderly resident who innocently asked why the clubhouse renovation budget had tripled from its original estimate. We don't owe anyone a line-by-line breakdown, Karen said, her voice sharper than usual, a crack finally showing in her practiced composure. I recorded that meeting, as I had everyone since the truck fine incident, careful to follow every disclosure law Ohio required. That particular clip, Karen's irritation at basic budget questions, would later become one of several damning pieces in a much larger picture I was assembling. Brittany's behavior escalated alongside Karen's. She began leaving passive-aggressive notes on my mailbox about trash can placement, despite my Ken sitting in the exact same spot as every neighbor's. A spot that had never once triggered a violation before that particular week. I photographed every note, dated every incident, and started noticing something Renee had predicted. A pattern emerging where every escalation against my family coincided suspiciously with dates close to board meetings where uncomfortable financial questions had been asked. Mine or anyone else's. It became clear Karen wasn't simply prejudiced in some abstract sense. She was strategically prejudiced, using her bias as a tool to intimidate whichever residents threatened her position most. And right now, that meant me, a homeowner who refused to simply pay fines and disappear quietly. Dana, initially hesitant about my growing file, started contributing her own observations, noting that Karen's tone with white neighbors during the same meetings remained warm and familiar, while every question from Black or Latino residents received clipped, dismissive responses regardless of the question's actual content. We began comparing notes with the Delgados and with Gloria, discovering at least 4 other households who'd experienced eerily similar patterns over the past 3 years: selective fines, sudden security scrutiny, dismissive board treatment, always following the same emotional temperature Karen set. Renee suggested formally organizing these accounts into something more structured. Not yet a lawsuit, but a documented pattern that could support a discrimination complaint with the state's Civil Rights Commission if things continued escalating. Which by every indication, they absolutely would. I started a private group chat with the affected families. Careful and quiet, agreeing collectively not to confront Karen individually anymore but to document everything and share information, turning what had been isolated frustration into something resembling coordinated, patient resistance. Karen, unaware of this quiet coalition forming beneath her notice, continued operating exactly as she always had, confident that no single homeowner would ever gather enough courage or evidence to challenge 11 years of unquestioned control over Brookhaven Estates. It was around this stretch of weeks that Frank mentioned something almost in passing, something that would later prove far more significant than either of us realized at the time, that the property management company contracted by the HOA board was up for renewal that year. Whoever controls that contract renewal, Frank said, sipping his coffee on his porch, basically controls who runs day-to-day operations here for the next 5 years. Karen's pushed the same management company through every renewal since she took over. I filed that detail away too. For a stretch of about 3 weeks, things went unusually quiet. No new fines arrived. Brittany's notes stopped. Board meeting during that period sounded almost normal, businesslike, as though some internal fire had briefly cooled down on its own. Dana wondered aloud if maybe Karen had simply moved on to some other target, some other family unlucky enough to catch her attention. I doubted it. Down out of guilt. They cool down when they're distracted by something bigger threatening them directly. I used that quiet stretch productively, meeting privately with Renee to review everything I'd gathered, the zoning violation on Karen's own property, the delayed reserve fund audit, the recorded meetings, the pattern of selective enforcement documented across 5 separate households. Renee organized it all into a clean timeline, explaining that whatever move I eventually made needed to hit multiple angles simultaneously: financial mismanagement, discriminatory enforcement, and Karen's own unpermitted renovation, because HOA boards were notoriously slow to act on any single complaint alone. During this lull, I also quietly expanded my company's regional footprint, closing a contract that would soon make Reed Logistics one of the largest employers in the county's growing tech corridor, a fact that remained completely invisible to anyone at Brookhaven, including Karen herself. Elijah's confidence slowly returned during those calm weeks too, though he still glanced nervously toward the clubhouse whenever we drove past it. A small residual fear I hated seeing in my 12-year-old son's eyes over something that should never have touched him at all. Gloria mentioned during one quiet coffee chat that Karen had been seen meeting privately with someone from the property management company's regional office.
More frequently than usual. Always arriving in expensive cars that seemed inconsistent with a volunteer HOA president's modest municipal salary of exactly $0.
I asked Renee whether HOA presidents typically received any compensation. She confirmed most didn't, beyond minor reimbursements, which made Karen's increasingly visible lifestyle upgrades, a new car, a remodeled kitchen, expensive vacations posted occasionally to a semi-private social media account, worth quietly noting. Priya, ever resourceful, mentioned she'd seen Karen's name attached to a landscaping invoice from a company that, according to public business records, was registered to an address suspiciously close to Karen's own home, a detail that raised immediate questions about potential self-dealing. Renee's eyes lit up again at that discovery. If she's routing HOA landscaping contracts through a shell company tied to her own address, Renee said, that's not just embarrassing. Depending on the dollar amounts involved, that's potentially outright fraud against her own neighbors. We didn't rush. That timing mattered more than speed. That presenting incomplete evidence too early would simply give Karen room to explain it away, destroy documents, or pressure witnesses into silence before the full picture could ever reach the right people. During that quiet period, I also reconnected, almost by accident, with an old business associate named Terrence, who mentioned during a casual dinner that his investment group had recently acquired a controlling stake in a mid-sized property management company expanding aggressively into Ohio suburbs. I didn't think much of it at the time beyond simple professional interest, filing the conversation away as one more piece of industry small talk, unaware of how directly it would eventually intersect with everything unfolding back at Brookhaven Estates. The calm ended abruptly on a Tuesday evening when Brittany, apparently having grown bored of restraint, posted a public comment on the community's private social media page mocking certain residents who think driving nice cars makes them important around here, clearly aimed at me. Several neighbors, including some who'd never spoken to me before, reacted with laughing emojis, and I realized the humiliation from that clubhouse encounter months earlier had quietly become neighborhood folklore, a story Karen's inner circle apparently enjoyed retelling at my expense. I screenshotted the post immediately, timestamped it, and sent it directly to Renee, who confirmed it strengthened our discrimination pattern considerably. Public mockery from an HOA staff member, tied directly to race and perceived economic status, was exactly the kind of evidence civil rights investigators looked for. Karen, when I called to formally complain about the post, initially defended Brittany, insisting it was just a joke and that I was being overly sensitive about nothing. Her dismissiveness, recorded in full per Ohio's disclosure laws, became another entry in Renee's growing file. 2 days later, the fines resumed, harsher than before. A $150 charge for improper holiday decoration placement, despite my lights matching the exact style and timing of every other house on Sycamore Lane. none of whom received a single notice that season. I appealed again, formally, citing the obvious inconsistency, attaching photos of 3 neighboring houses with identical decorations receiving no violation notices whatsoever. The appeal was denied within 24 hours, an unusually fast rejection compared to the weeks-long silence my previous appeals had received. Renee noted the speed itself was telling. Karen wasn't even bothering to maintain the appearance of due process anymore, growing sloppy in her confidence that no consequence would ever reach her, a confidence that historically preceded exactly the kind of downfall we were quietly building toward. Elijah's school friend, whose family also lived in Brookhaven, mentioned that his own parents had received a similar bogus fine that same week, a detail that widened our documented pattern even further, now spanning 6 households experiencing suspiciously coordinated selective enforcement. I started noticing security cars parked near my house more frequently, always brief, always unexplained, a low-grade intimidation tactic that Dana found more unsettling than the fines themselves. "She's trying to make us feel watched," Dana said. "That's the actual goal here," Renee agreed, explaining that harassment campaigns like this often escalated specifically when the target refused visible signs of surrender. And my continued attendance at board meetings, calm and prepared, clearly registered to Karen as defiance rather than the compliance she expected. At the next board meeting, Karen attempted something bolder, proposing a new bylaw amendment requiring enhanced identification verification for any resident requesting financial disclosures, a thinly veiled attempt to make my ongoing records requests more difficult without naming me directly. I stood during public comment and asked, calmly and clearly, whether this new requirement would apply retroactively to requests already filed, a question that visibly flustered Karen, who hadn't anticipated anyone parsing her proposal's legal language quite so precisely in front of the room. The board, several of whom I suspected were growing quietly uncomfortable with Karen's increasingly obvious targeting, tabled the amendment for further review, a small procedural delay, but a delay nonetheless. One more sign that Karen's absolute control was beginning to show hairline cracks. Karen cornered me in the parking lot afterward, her voice dropping the sugary tone entirely for the first time. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she said quietly, close enough that only I could hear. "This is my neighborhood. I built this place." I met her eyes steadily. "Karen, that makes me a resident, not a guest," she laughed, short and bitter. "For now," she said, turning away, leaving that phrase hanging in the humid evening air like a promise of something worse still coming. That night I told Renee about the parking lot exchange, and she immediately flagged it as a possible escalation warning. "People like her don't threaten unless they're feeling cornered," Renee said. "Something's making her nervous beyond just you. We need to find out what." We didn't have to wait long. A rumor spread through the neighborhood that the property management company's contract renewal, the one Frank had mentioned months earlier, was facing unexpected competition from an outside firm submitting a significantly lower, more transparent bid. Karen, according to Priya's careful eavesdropping near the clubhouse, seemed unusually agitated about this development, making urgent phone calls behind closed doors, her usual composed authority replaced by something closer to genuine panic whenever the topic of contract renewal surfaced. I mentioned this new detail to Terrence during our next casual catch-up, and his expression shifted with sudden interest. "Wait," he said slowly. "Brookhaven Estates? That's actually one of the communities on our expansion shortlist. Small world. Contract for months." The pieces began aligning in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Terrence's investment group, the one quietly acquiring property management companies across Ohio, was the exact outside competitor threatening Karen's comfortable, unquestioned control over Brookhaven's day-to-day operations and, apparently, its finances. I didn't reveal my personal stake in the situation to Terrence yet, keeping my composure the way I always did in business negotiations, gathering information calmly before ever showing my full hand, a discipline that had served my company well through every difficult deal. Renee, when I told her about this coincidence, actually laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. "If your friend's company wins that contract," she said, "Karen loses her entire operational shield overnight. New management means new audits, new oversight, new eyes on every invoice." The timeline suddenly felt less abstract and more urgent. If the contract decision was approaching, our documented pattern of discrimination, financial irregularities, and unpermitted renovations needed to be ready to present at exactly the right moment. Not too early, not too late. I spent the following weekend organizing everything into a single, clean document: dates, photographs, recorded call transcripts, zoning records, the shell company landscaping invoice, witness statements from 6 affected households, all cross-referenced and chronologically sorted for maximum clarity and impact. Dana reviewed the document with me late one night, her face growing increasingly grim as she saw the full scope laid out together for the first time. "This isn't just petty HOA drama anymore," she said quietly. "This is actual, provable corruption." Renee agreed completely, suggesting we prepare 2 parallel tracks, a formal discrimination complaint with the State Civil Rights Commission, and a separate financial mismanagement report to be presented directly to the full HOA board once the timing felt right. Meanwhile, Karen's public behavior grew increasingly erratic, snapping at residents over minor questions during clubhouse hours, canceling one scheduled board meeting entirely without explanation, behavior wildly out of character for a woman who'd spent 11 years projecting effortless, icy control. Brittany, sensing her boss's mounting stress, seemed to overcompensate by becoming even more openly hostile toward me specifically, once refusing outright to process a simple maintenance request form, claiming without any basis that my account was flagged for review. I requested clarification in writing about what exactly flagged for review meant under the association's bylaws. Brittany never responded. Renee flagged the refusal itself as another actionable data point, a documented denial of basic homeowner services with no legitimate justification offered anywhere on record. Around this time, Frank shared something new. Apparently Karen had been overheard on a phone call referring to the incoming outside management bid as those people trying to take what's mine, language that struck Frank as strange given Karen didn't technically own anything at Brookhaven beyond her own house. "She talks about this neighborhood like it's her personal kingdom," Frank said, shaking his head. 11 years running things unchecked will do that to a person, I suppose. I nodded, thinking privately about exactly how unchecked those 11 years had actually been. I finally decided to reach out to the state's HOA Oversight Division directly, not to file the full complaint yet, but simply to confirm the correct procedural channels, ensuring that whenever we did move forward, every step would hold up under whatever scrutiny followed. The oversight representative I spoke with mentioned, almost offhandedly, that discrimination complaints involving property management transitions often moved faster when time to coincide with contract renewal reviews, since incoming management companies typically welcome documentation that justified replacing problematic leadership. That detail reshaped our entire strategy. Renee and I agreed the ideal moment to formally submit everything would be precisely when the board's contract renewal vote approached, maximizing pressure on Karen at the exact moment she had the least room left to maneuver. I called Terrence again, this time more directly, asking careful questions about his firm's timeline for the Brookhaven bid without revealing my personal connection to the community just yet. He mentioned the board vote was tentatively scheduled for roughly 6 weeks out. 6 weeks. Time to finalize documentation, formally file the discrimination complaint, and quietly notify select board members of the financial irregularities. All before the contract vote that would determine whether Karen retained any real operational control whatsoever. Dana, watching me plan this out with the same intensity one brought to closing major business contracts, finally said something that stuck with me. "You're not doing this for revenge," she said. "You're doing this because somebody has to, and nobody else ever would." She was right. Mostly. There was a personal edge to it too. An old wound from that humiliating afternoon at the clubhouse counter that hadn't fully healed. But mostly, I recognized, this was about every family Karen had quietly pushed out before anyone documented the pattern. Gloria, Priya, Frank, and the Delgados all agreed to formally submit witness statements once the timing was right, each one describing their own experiences with Karen's selective enforcement in careful, factual language Renee helped them draft to withstand any legal scrutiny. Karen, oblivious to the 6-week countdown quietly ticking toward her, escalated her behavior further, issuing a new fine against my property for excessive vehicle presence, after Dana's sister parked her car in our driveway for a single overnight family visit. I no longer bothered appealing individual fines through normal channels. Each one simply became another dated entry in the master document. Another small brick in a wall of evidence that would eventually stand entirely on its own. Undeniable and overwhelming once fully assembled. Brittany, apparently frustrated by my calm refusal to visibly react to any of it, made her boldest move yet, posting publicly on the community page that certain residents were playing victim to distract from their own rule-breaking, tagging my name directly for the first time. That public tagging proved to be a serious miscalculation on her part. Renee immediately flagged it as clear, documented, public harassment tied directly to protected discrimination complaints already in preparation, strengthening our case considerably beyond what private incidents alone could have provided. I screenshotted everything, forwarded it to Renee within minutes, and for the first time allowed myself a small, quiet moment of grim satisfaction. Every escalation Karen and Brittany chose to make only handed us sharper, more public, more undeniable evidence of exactly what we needed. Word of the tagged post spread quickly through the neighborhood's private chat groups, and to my surprise, several residents I'd never spoken with directly reached out privately to express discomfort with how openly Karen's office seemed to be targeting me specifically. One such resident, a woman named Carol who'd lived at Brookhaven even longer than Karen had served as president, mentioned she'd witnessed similar treatment against a Vietnamese family years earlier, Details that added yet another documented account to our steadily growing pattern. Carol agreed to speak with Renee directly, providing a timeline stretching back nearly 7 years, well before I'd even moved into Brookhaven. Proof that Karen's discriminatory enforcement wasn't an isolated response to me personally, but a long-standing, deliberate operational pattern. Renee was thrilled by this development. 7 years of documented pattern, she said, completely changes how seriously the Civil Rights Commission will treat this. This isn't one angry homeowner's complaint anymore. This is a structural problem this board has ignored for years. I began quietly preparing a private meeting with 2 board members I'd identified as potentially sympathetic, quieter voices who'd occasionally voted
against Karen's more aggressive proposals, likely uncomfortable with her methods but too intimidated to challenge her leadership publicly on their own.
One of them, a soft-spoken engineer named David, agreed to meet privately at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood, visibly nervous, glancing toward the door repeatedly as though worried Karen might somehow materialize and catch him speaking with me. David confirmed something crucial. The board had, in fact, quietly discussed concerns about the delayed reserve fund audit months earlier, but Karen had convinced enough members that pursuing it would be divisive and unnecessary, effectively burying the issue before it ever reached residents. She's very good at making people feel like questioning her is somehow rude, David admitted. I've wanted to push back for years. I just never felt like I had enough backing to actually do it without getting targeted myself. I understood that fear completely. I assured David that our documentation was thorough enough now to protect anyone willing to finally speak up. And he agreed, cautiously, to review our master file privately before the upcoming contract renewal vote, provided his name stayed confidential until absolutely necessary. With David's quiet cooperation secured, Renee and I finalized the formal discrimination complaint for submission to the State Civil Rights Commission, timed carefully to land roughly 2 weeks before the scheduled property management contract vote. Exactly as planned. Karen's escalation, meanwhile, reached a genuinely alarming new level. Security footage Frank later shared showed a guard, clearly following new instructions, following Elijah on his bicycle for nearly 10 minutes around the neighborhood loop, an act with no legitimate safety justification whatsoever. Dana was shaking with fury when she saw that footage. "She's targeting our child now," she said, her voice trembling with a rage I'd rarely seen from her. I felt something inside me shift too, past careful patience into something closer to controlled fury. Renee, reviewing the footage, confirmed it constituted a serious escalation, potentially crossing from HOA overreach into genuine harassment of a minor. Information she immediately flagged for inclusion in an urgent supplemental filing to the Civil Rights Commission ahead of schedule. I confronted Karen directly this time, calling her personally instead of routing through Brittany, my voice steady despite the anger underneath. "Explain to me," I said, "why security was instructed to follow my 12-year-old son around the neighborhood for 10 minutes. Karen's response was cold and unapologetic. "Security has full authority to monitor anyone they deem suspicious," she said. "Maybe your son shouldn't be riding around unsupervised looking like he doesn't belong here." The line went dead before I could respond. That single sentence, recorded in full per Ohio's legal disclosure requirements, became the most damning piece of evidence in our entire file. An explicit, undeniable admission tying her enforcement decisions directly to how a child looked rather than any actual rule violated. Renee could barely contain her reaction when I sent her the recording. "This is it," she said. "This single clip alone could carry a discrimination case on its own merits. Combined with everything else, this isn't a complaint anymore. This is a landslide waiting to happen." I called an emergency meeting with Dana, Renee, David, and the other affected families that same week, laying out the full timeline for the coming weeks: formal complaint filing, supplemental urgent evidence submission, quiet coordination with sympathetic board members, all converging toward the contract vote. Karen, seemingly aware on some instinctive level that something was shifting beneath her, grew increasingly paranoid, accusing Brittany openly during one clubhouse visit of not doing enough to keep residents in line. Attention crack Priya happened to witness and immediately reported to me. Brittany, apparently rattled by Karen's mounting pressure, began distancing herself slightly, no longer initiating confrontations herself but still following every instruction Karen issued, a dynamic Renee noted might eventually make Brittany a useful, if reluctant, witness if things escalated far enough. The next board meeting arrived tense and charged. Karen visibly exhausted, her usual polished composure fraying at the edges as she rushed through agenda items, clearly eager to avoid extended discussion on any topic that might invite uncomfortable scrutiny from the room. I stood during public comment once more, this time simply announcing, calmly and without elaboration, that I had recently become aware of several serious concerns regarding association operations, and would be pursuing appropriate channels to address them. Karen's face went visibly pale. She recovered quickly, dismissing my statement as vague grievances unworthy of the board's time. But David later told me privately that 2 other board members exchanged uneasy glances the moment I spoke, clearly sensing something significant was building beneath the surface. Karen's paranoia deepened over the following days. Frank reported seeing her walking the neighborhood personally, unusual for someone who typically delegated all fieldwork to Brittany or security, inspecting mailboxes and driveways with an intensity that struck several residents as genuinely unsettling. She issued 3 new fines that single week alone, all directed at households connected to our quiet coalition, an escalation so blatant that even residents previously uninvolved began privately messaging me, asking what exactly was happening and whether they should be worried too. Renee saw this widening ripple as an opportunity, encouraging me to quietly invite a few more affected households into our documentation effort, expanding our pattern evidence even further while carefully maintaining confidentiality until the formal complaint was ready for submission. By the following week, our coalition had grown to 9 households, each contributing dated accounts, screenshots, and in some cases their own recorded phone calls, painting an increasingly undeniable picture of years of coordinated, racially targeted selective enforcement throughout Brookhaven estates. Karen, seemingly sensing the walls beginning to close in without understanding exactly why, made her most reckless move yet, instructing Brittany to draft a mass email to all residents implying that certain troublemakers were spreading false rumors to destabilize the community. The email, sent without board approval according to David, backfired spectacularly. Several previously uninvolved residents reached out to me directly afterward, uncomfortable with the email's tone, asking pointed questions about what exactly Karen was so afraid of certain residents discovering. Renee added the unauthorized mass email to our file immediately, noting it demonstrated a clear pattern of retaliation against residents pursuing legitimate grievances. Precisely the kind of behavior civil rights investigators considered strong corroborating evidence of intentional discriminatory conduct. I finally submitted the formal discrimination complaint to the State Civil Rights Commission that Friday, attaching every document, recording, photograph, and witness statement we'd carefully assembled over the preceding months, a file so thorough it ran nearly 200 pages. Renee submitted the supplemental financial mismanagement report simultaneously, directed at the full HOA board, detailing the shell company landscaping invoices, the delayed reserve audit, and Karen's own unpermitted home renovation, sourced entirely from public records and verified documentation. We timed both submissions deliberately, arriving just 11 days before the scheduled property management contract renewal vote, ensuring maximum pressure at the precise moment Karen's operational control over Brookhaven's finances and enforcement mechanisms hung most vulnerably in the balance. Karen received formal notification of the discrimination complaint 3 days later, and according to Frank, who happened to be near the clubhouse that afternoon, her reaction was audible even through closed office doors, a level of panic entirely unlike her usual icy control. Brittany, apparently realizing for the first time the actual severity of what she'd participated in, began distancing herself more visibly, calling in sick for 2 consecutive days. A pattern Renee noted might indicate she was already anticipating potential personal legal exposure. Karen called an emergency closed-door board session, excluding residents entirely, though David later confirmed to me privately that the meeting had devolved into shouting. Several board members demanding answers about the financial irregularities now formally documented in Renee's supplemental report. David texted me late that night, shaken. She tried to convince everyone it was all a coordinated smear campaign, he wrote. But 2 board members already knew about the delayed audit. She couldn't spin her way out of it this time. I felt something settle in my chest that night. Not triumph exactly, but a grim, steady clarity that 11 years of unchecked authority were finally beginning to unravel under the weight of documentation nobody had ever bothered assembling this thoroughly before. Karen, apparently desperate to control the narrative, requested a private meeting with me directly, the first time in over a year she'd addressed me without contempt in her voice. I agreed, with Renee's blessing, provided the meeting was formally recorded per Ohio disclosure law. She met me at a neutral coffee shop, visibly diminished from the commanding figure I'd first encountered at that welcome meeting years earlier. "Can we resolve this quietly?" she said. "Without dragging the whole neighborhood through something ugly?" Her voice had lost its usual edge. "You had years to resolve this quietly," I said. "Every fine, every note, every security guard following my son. You chose escalation every single time." Karen's composure cracked slightly, something almost like genuine fear flickering behind her carefully maintained mask. "I built this community," she said, her voice rising. 11 years. And now you want to destroy everything I've worked for over one misunderstanding at the front desk. I looked at her steadily. This was never one misunderstanding, Karen. You know that better than anyone. She left the coffee shop without another word. And Renee, reviewing the recording afterward, noted that Karen's own statements during that meeting, an implicit admission of awareness regarding the broader pattern, only further strengthened the case already building against her. The following week brought Karen's most dangerous escalation yet. Frank called me late one evening, his voice tight with concern, reporting that Karen had personally requested access to the clubhouse security archives, apparently searching for anything she could use to discredit me personally. Renee immediately flagged this as a serious concern, potentially constituting witness intimidation or evidence tampering if Karen attempted to alter or delete footage relevant to the ongoing discrimination complaint, and advised me to formally request preservation of all security records immediately. I submitted that preservation request directly to the Property Management Company's regional office, copying the State Civil Rights Commission investigator, now formally assigned to our case, ensuring any attempt to alter or delete relevant footage would carry serious legal consequences for whoever tried it. Karen, apparently undeterred, made her boldest and most reckless move of the entire ordeal. She instructed the Property Management Company to draft eviction paperwork against my household, citing a fabricated pattern of repeated bylaw violations that existed almost entirely on paper alone. Renee's reaction, when I forwarded the eviction notice, was somewhere between disbelief and grim satisfaction. "She just handed us actionable retaliation," Renee said.
"Filing eviction proceedings against a homeowner actively pursuing..."
I didn't panic. Though Dana admitted she'd spent that entire evening close to tears, terrified for the first time that this fight had genuinely endangered our home rather than simply our peace of mind. Renee assured us the notice had no legitimate legal standing whatsoever. "HOAs can fine you," Renee explained calmly. "They generally cannot evict a homeowner from property they own outright over disputed violations, especially ones this clearly fabricated. This is either desperation or someone advising her very, very poorly." We learned days later, through David, that Karen had bypassed the full board entirely to issue that eviction paperwork. A serious procedural violation of the association's own bylaws requiring majority board approval for any action of that severity against a homeowner. David, visibly shaken by how far Karen had gone, finally agreed to go fully on record, providing a sworn statement detailing years of board intimidation, the buried audit, and now this unauthorized eviction attempt, a decision that would prove pivotal in everything still to come. Renee filed an emergency motion with the Civil Rights Commission highlighting the eviction attempt as clear, actionable retaliation, while simultaneously notifying Terrence's investment group, now formally the leading bidder for the management contract, of the serious governance failures occurring under current leadership. Terrence, upon learning for the first time that I was personally connected to Brookhaven Estates, called me directly, stunned by the coincidence. "Marcus," he said, "this is the exact community we've been trying to win the contract for. This changes everything on our end." I finally told him the full story. The humiliation at the clubhouse counter, the months of documented harassment, the eviction attempt against my own family, and Terrence went quiet for a long moment before responding with something I hadn't expected at all. "My firm doesn't just want the management contract anymore," he said slowly. "After hearing this, we're prepared to make an aggressive move. There's actually a mechanism in most HOA contracts allowing majority stakeholders to petition for emergency board restructuring during transitions." Renee, when I relayed this new information, immediately recognized the opportunity. "If Terrence's firm wins the contract and petitions for restructuring," she said, "that could mean an entirely new oversight board, potentially removing Karen from any position of authority far sooner than we anticipated." The property management vote was now just 4 days away. And everything we'd built over the preceding months, the discrimination complaint, the financial mismanagement report, the eviction retaliation filing, David's sworn statement, was converging toward a single, decisive moment. Karen, seemingly sensing her control slipping entirely, made one final desperate move, attempting to schedule an emergency early vote on the contract renewal, hoping to push through the existing management company before Terrence's firm's competing bid could be fully considered. David alerted me immediately, and Renee moved fast, filing an emergency objection with the board citing procedural violations in how the early vote had been scheduled without proper notice, a technicality that, combined with everything else, finally forced Karen's hand into the open. The board, no longer willing to shield Karen from mounting scrutiny, voted to postpone any contract decision until a full, formal review of both bids could occur. A review that would now inevitably include public discussion of the discrimination complaint and financial irregularities already filed. Karen's authority, unquestioned for 11 years, was crumbling faster than even Renee had predicted. Brittany, sensing the shifting ground beneath her own feet, quietly reached out to Renee's office requesting information about cooperating with an investigation in exchange for reduced personal liability. Renee agreed to hear Brittany out, and what emerged from that conversation proved explosive. Brittany admitted, under recorded and legally disclosed conditions, that Karen had personally instructed her, repeatedly, to watch certain residents more closely based on how they looked. That admission, corroborated independently by both David's sworn statement and Karen's own recorded comment about Elijah, formed an unbroken chain of evidence connecting Karen directly to intentional, ongoing racial discrimination spanning years. Not isolated incidents but deliberate, sustained policy. Brittany also revealed something none of us had anticipated. The landscaping shell company tied to Karen's home address wasn't simply self-dealing. Records she'd handled personally showed invoices inflated nearly 40% above market rate. Funds funneled quietly into accounts Karen controlled directly. Renee's reaction to this new revelation was immediate. "This isn't just HOA misconduct anymore," she said. Inflated invoices routed through a shell company controlled by the person authorizing payment is straightforward embezzlement. And now we have an internal witness confirming it directly. The financial figures, once Renee's forensic accountant reviewed them properly, were staggering. Over 4 years, nearly $200,000 in HOA reserve funds had been quietly diverted through inflated landscaping invoices, funds meant for community maintenance and long-term infrastructure repairs. I sat with Dana that evening, both of us stunned by the scale of it. $200,000, Dana said quietly, from people paying their dues on time every single month. Trusting her completely, the scope of the betrayal finally felt fully real. Renee immediately expanded our filing to include the embezzlement evidence, coordinating with both the Civil Rights Commission and, now necessarily, local law enforcement, since financial crimes of this scale moved well beyond what any HOA board could resolve internally on its own. Karen, apparently unaware her own assistant had already begun cooperating with investigators, continued campaigning aggressively among residents to delay the property management vote further, framing herself publicly as a victim of baseless attacks from disgruntled troublemakers within the community. Her framing found less traction than she expected. Word of the eviction attempt against my family, the sworn statements, and rumors of financial irregularities had spread quietly but steadily through the neighborhood's private channels, eroding the unquestioning trust she'd relied on for over a decade. Carol, the longtime resident who'd first mentioned the Vietnamese family's earlier experience, organized an informal petition among concerned homeowners, requesting a full independent financial audit, gathering signatures faster than anyone expected. A clear sign community patience had finally run out. I attended the next scheduled board meeting fully prepared. Renee beside me, David seated visibly among the board members rather than shrinking into the background, and a packed room of residents who'd never before shown much interest in HOA governance suddenly paying close attention. Karen opened the meeting attempting her usual composed authority, but her voice carried a brittleness that hadn't been there months earlier, cracks in a facade that 11 years of unchecked power had allowed her to maintain far longer than it probably should have. Before we proceed with tonight's agenda, Karen began, I want to address some troubling rumors circulating about. She stopped abruptly as Renee stood, formally requesting the floor as legal counsel representing multiple homeowners with active complaints against current association leadership. The room went silent. David. Then toward Brittany seated quietly near the back, refusing to meet her gaze. And for the first time since I'd known her, Karen Whitfield looked genuinely, visibly afraid of what was coming next. Renee spoke clearly and methodically, summarizing the discrimination complaint now formally under state investigation, the eviction retaliation attempt, and the preliminary embezzlement findings, careful to present everything factually, without embellishment, letting the sheer weight of documented evidence speak for itself. Gasps rippled through the room as Renee detailed the $200,000 in diverted reserve funds. Residents exchanging stunned glances, several visibly recalculating years of trust they'd extended to a woman who'd apparently been quietly stealing from them the entire time. Karen attempted to interrupt several times, insisting the figures were grossly exaggerated and the claims completely fabricated by people with personal vendettas. But her voice lacked its usual commanding force, faltering under the collective weight of the room's growing disbelief and anger. David finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly but resolute, confirming publicly what he'd previously only shared privately, that the board had known about irregularities in the reserve audit for over a year and had been actively discouraged from investigating further by Karen personally. The room erupted into overlapping conversation, residents demanding answers, several standing to address the board directly. A level of open confrontation Brookhaven's clubhouse had likely never witnessed in its entire history of carefully managed, tightly controlled community meetings. Karen tried once more to regain control of the room, her voice rising sharply. This is a coordinated attack, she said, orchestrated by people who never belonged in this community to begin with. The words landed exactly as damning as her earlier recorded comments about Elijah, a resident I'd never spoken to before. An older man near the back stood and said loudly, "Who exactly doesn't belong here? Karen?" The question hung in the air, and Karen, cornered on every side by evidence and public sentiment, had no answer prepared. Brittany, seated quietly through the growing chaos, finally stood herself, her voice trembling but clear. "I need to say something," she announced, and the room fell into stunned silence, watching Karen's own former loyal assistant step forward in front of everyone. Karen instructed me directly, multiple times, to monitor certain residents based on their race, Brittany said, her voice cracking slightly. I followed those instructions because I was afraid of losing my position. I regret that more than I can say right now. Karen's face drained of all color, staring at Brittany with an expression somewhere between betrayal and disbelief, watching her most loyal enforcer publicly confirm, in front of the entire assembled community, exactly the discriminatory culture she'd spent years denying existed at all. You're lying, Karen said, her voice cracking under pressure for the first time I'd ever witnessed. I never said anything like that. Brittany, visibly steadying herself, replied quietly, I have the text messages, Karen. I saved everything, just in case. That single sentence changed the entire trajectory of the meeting. Renee immediately requested those text messages be formally submitted as evidence. And Brittany, visibly relieved to finally unburden herself, agreed on the spot to provide everything to both Renee and the assigned state investigator. The room's mood shifted from stunned disbelief into something closer to collective outrage. Residents who'd quietly tolerated Karen's control for years now openly questioning how they'd allowed one person's unchecked authority to persist for so long without meaningful pushback. Karen attempted one final defense, turning toward the board directly. I have led this community for 11 years, she said, her voice unsteady. Surely that counts for something against a handful of complaints from people who simply don't understand how HOAs function. $200,000 isn't a misunderstanding. Karen, David said, standing fully now, his earlier nervousness replaced by something firmer. And telling a security guard to follow a 12-year-old boy because of how he looks isn't a misunderstanding either. The board president, a quiet woman named Susan who rarely spoke during meetings, finally addressed the room directly. Given the severity of what's been presented tonight, she said, I'm calling for an immediate vote on Karen Whitfield's continued position as HOA president. Karen's protests grew increasingly desperate, but the board, no longer willing to shield her from consequences that had clearly been building for years, moved forward with the vote despite her objections. Residents in the audience watching with a mixture of shock and quiet satisfaction. The vote proceeded swiftly. 6 board members in favor of immediate removal. 1 abstention. 0 votes in Karen's favor. A stunning collapse of support for a woman who had, until that very evening, seemed practically untouchable within the community she'd governed for over a decade. Karen sat frozen for a long moment after the vote was announced. The room's silence heavier than any shouting could have been, before standing abruptly and walking out of the clubhouse without another word. Her composure finally, completely shattered in front of everyone. I felt no immediate triumph watching her leave, only a strange, heavy relief, the kind that comes after carrying something exhausting for far too long, finally allowed to set it down, even knowing there was still considerably more ahead before this was truly finished. Susan, now acting HOA president, immediately called for a formal independent audit of all financial records, appointing a temporary oversight committee that included David and, to my surprise, formally invited me to participate given my documented business and legal expertise. The following morning, news of Karen's removal spread rapidly through the neighborhood. Residents who'd never spoken to me directly before suddenly stopping by to express quiet apologies for having stayed silent through years of behavior they'd noticed but never challenged themselves. Renee, Meanwhile, coordinated closely with the State Civil Rights Commission investigator, submitting Brittany's text message evidence alongside everything else already filed, strengthening what was already becoming one of the most thoroughly documented HOA discrimination cases the Commission had seen in years. Terrence's investment group, upon learning of Karen's sudden removal, moved quickly to finalize their management contract proposal, now facing considerably less resistance from a board eager to demonstrate meaningful reform after the public revelations of the previous evening's meeting. I met with Terrence directly that week, finally revealing the full personal context behind my earlier casual interest in his company's expansion plans. He listened intently, then made an offer that genuinely surprised me. We need someone respected locally to help oversee this transition properly. Would you consider serving as a temporary community liaison during the management transition? Terrence asked. Someone residents actually trust, who understands both the business side and what's been happening here firsthand. I told him I'd think about it, though I already suspected my answer. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation into Karen's embezzlement accelerated rapidly. Forensic accountants confirmed Renee's earlier estimate, ultimately tracing over $215,000 diverted through inflated landscaping invoices routed through the shell company registered to Karen's own address. Local news picked up the story within days. A segment airing about an HOA president removed amid discrimination allegations and financial fraud, though I deliberately kept my own name out of most public statements, preferring the community's collective evidence to speak louder than any individual grievance. Karen, according to Frank, had reportedly hired a defense attorney and was attempting to negotiate some form of restitution agreement to avoid formal criminal charges, though the county prosecutor's office, once fully briefed on the scale and duration of the fraud, seemed disinclined toward leniency. Brittany, having cooperated fully and voluntarily with investigators, avoided formal charges entirely, though she resigned from her clubhouse position and, according to Priya, moved out of the area entirely within a month, apparently unable to face the community she'd helped Karen intimidate for so long. The eviction paperwork Karen had illegally initiated against my family was formally dismissed within days. Renee ensuring the dismissal included a written acknowledgement that it had been improperly filed without required board approval. A small but satisfying piece of formal vindication. Susan's temporary oversight committee moved quickly to reverse several of Karen's most damaging policies, including the security monitoring protocols that had targeted Elijah, replacing them with clear, race-neutral guidelines developed in consultation with a civil rights compliance specialist Renee recommended. I accepted Terrence's offer to serve as temporary community liaison during the management transition, partly out of genuine desire to help repair what Karen had damaged, partly out of quiet satisfaction at helping oversee exactly the kind of institutional accountability she'd spent years evading. Dana watched me take on this new role with a mixture of pride and relief. You didn't have to become the person who fixes this place, she said, echoing her earlier words from months before. But I'm glad you did anyway. Honestly, the Civil Rights Commission's formal investigation concluded roughly 6 weeks later, finding substantial evidence of a sustained, intentional pattern of racial discrimination in enforcement practices under Karen's leadership, spanning at least 7 years and affecting at minimum 11 documented households. The findings recommended formal sanctions against the HOA itself, alongside mandatory compliance training for all future board members and staff, a resolution Susan's oversight committee accepted immediately, eager to demonstrate genuine institutional reform rather than mere token gestures. Karen, facing mounting legal pressure from both the criminal embezzlement investigation and the civil rights findings, ultimately accepted a plea agreement, requiring full financial restitution, formal admission of the discriminatory conduct, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA leadership role statewide. I read that final detail twice when Renee shared it with me. A lifetime ban from HOA leadership anywhere in Ohio. A fittingly precise consequence for someone who had built her entire identity around wielding exactly that kind of unchecked institutional authority over others. The restitution figure, once fully calculated including interest and legal costs, came to just over $300,000. Funds that would be returned to Brookhaven's reserve account, finally restoring the community infrastructure fund Karen had quietly drained for years. Frank mentioned, almost wistfully, that Karen had put her house up for sale within weeks of the plea agreement becoming public, apparently unable to remain in a neighborhood where her reputation had collapsed so completely and so publicly in such a short span of time. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions watching the moving truck arrive outside Karen's house months later. Not quite satisfaction. Not quite sympathy. Something closer to the exhausted relief of watching a long, unnecessary conflict finally reach its inevitable, deserved conclusion. Elijah, watching from our porch, asked if I felt happy that Karen was finally leaving. I told him honestly that I mostly felt tired. The way you feel after finishing something difficult and necessary rather than something purely triumphant. A nuance he seemed to understand better than I expected. The community itself began healing slowly over the following months. Susan's oversight committee implementing transparent financial reporting practices, regular independent audits, and clear, consistently enforced bylaws applied equally regardless of who happened to be asking questions or requesting parking passes. Terrence's management company officially took over operations that following quarter, and I formally stepped back from my temporary liaison role once the transition stabilized, satisfied that the institutional safeguards now in place would make another Karen Whitfield considerably harder to sustain long-term. Renee, reflecting on the entire ordeal during our final formal meeting together, told me something I've thought about often since. Most people in your position would have just moved away like the Okafors did, she said. You chose to fix the actual problem instead. I told her honestly that I hadn't set out to fix anything grand. Only to protect my family from an injustice I refused to simply absorb quietly the way so many others before me apparently had. One careful, documented step at a time. Dana and I hosted a small gathering that spring, inviting Frank, Priya, Gloria, Carol, the Delgados, and David, an informal thank you for the quiet coalition that had ultimately made everything possible, each of them contributing a piece nobody alone could have assembled. Gloria raised a glass that evening, offering a simple, heartfelt toast to finally being heard, she said, and the small backyard gathering fell into a warm, comfortable silence. The kind that comes after something genuinely difficult has finally, properly resolved itself. Word eventually spread beyond Brookhaven entirely. Other HOA communities in the region reaching out informally to Renee's office, asking how residents, facing similar patterns of selective enforcement, might document and pursue their own complaints. Our case quietly becoming something of a regional template. I never expected that confronting one arrogant HOA president over a humiliating comment about a Bentley would eventually unravel years of financial fraud.
and discrimination affecting dozens of families. But looking back, I understood that arrogance like Karen's rarely stays contained to just one incident.
The property management transition brought immediate, tangible improvements, reduced monthly dues once the embezzlement drain stopped,
Transparent vendor.
contracts posted publicly, and a formal complaint process that guaranteed any resident, regardless of background, received equal, documented, timely responses. Elijah's confidence fully returned that summer, riding his bicycle freely around the neighborhood loop without a single guard ever questioning his presence again. A small, quiet normalcy that felt, after everything, like the most meaningful victory of the entire ordeal. 6 months after Karen's removal, I received an unexpected call from a journalist researching a broader story about institutional bias within homeowners associations nationwide, asking if I'd be willing to share our documented experience as a case study for other affected families. I agreed, cautiously, insisting the focus remain on the pattern and the accountability process rather than sensationalizing any individual, believing the more useful lesson wasn't about one particularly cruel HOA president, but about how ordinary people, patient and organized, could actually create change. The article, once published, generated considerable attention, several readers reaching out describing eerily similar experiences in their own communities, some crediting our detailed documentation approach for finally giving them a workable framework to challenge their own local HOA leadership. Karen, according to Frank's occasional updates, relocated to a smaller town 2 counties away, apparently attempting a quiet, anonymous fresh start, though the terms of her plea agreement ensured her name remained permanently flagged in Ohio's HOA leadership registry. A lasting institutional consequence. Brittany, from what Priya heard secondhand, eventually found work in an entirely unrelated field, apparently having learned enough from the entire experience to never again accept a position requiring the kind of blind institutional loyalty Karen had demanded from her for years. Susan continued serving as Brookhaven's HOA president long after the initial transition period ended, earning genuine community trust through consistent transparency. A stark contrast to the fear-based control Karen had relied upon for over a decade of unchallenged authority. I remained on the community's financial oversight committee for another full year, ensuring the new transparency measures took firm institutional root before eventually stepping back entirely, satisfied the systemic changes would outlast any single person's ongoing involvement or attention. Dana often reminded me, during quieter moments long after everything had settled, that the entire ordeal had ultimately strengthened our family rather than simply exhausting it, forcing us to fight together for something worth protecting rather than simply retreating quietly like so many others had. Elijah, now a teenager, occasionally brought up that difficult period during family conversations, processing it with a maturity that genuinely surprised me, understanding on some fundamental level that his father's calm, patient documentation had ultimately protected far more than just our own household. Looking back on that humiliating afternoon at the clubhouse counter, the mocking laughter over a simple parking pass request, I recognized it now as merely the visible surface of something far deeper and more damaging that had been quietly operating underneath Brookhaven's manicured exterior for years. Renee eventually left her HOA-focused practice to launch a dedicated civil rights consulting firm, citing our case as the turning point that convinced her there was genuine, sustained demand for exactly the kind of patient, thorough documentation approach we'd developed together throughout the ordeal. Terrence's management company, having successfully navigated the Brookhaven transition, used our case as a template for identifying similar governance failures across other communities in their expanding portfolio, quietly improving conditions for residents who might never even learn our names. I never did buy that Bentley. Incidentally, though I did eventually purchase a considerably more practical vehicle upgrade once Reed Logistics expanded into 2 additional states, a modest personal milestone that felt almost anticlimactic compared to everything else that single dealership visit had set into motion. Frank, now well into his 70s, still mentions the story occasionally to newer residents moving into Brookhaven, framing it less as neighborhood gossip and more as a cautionary lesson about the quiet dangers of unchecked institutional power left unquestioned for too many years. Carol's earlier account about the Vietnamese family who'd left years before my own confrontation with Karen eventually led to that family being formally
contacted during the investigation, offered a rare opportunity for acknowledgement and, where applicable, financial restitution for their own documented losses.
The Delgados, whose bogus renovation fine had been one of the earliest data points in our coalition's documentation, ultimately became close friends with our family, their own quiet courage in coming forward having meant considerably more than they likely ever realized at the time. Priya's careful, patient eavesdropping throughout the entire ordeal proved instrumental in nearly every major development. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable contributions come simply from people willing to pay quiet, careful attention when something feels genuinely, persistently wrong. David eventually ran for a permanent board position himself the following election cycle, winning easily, motivated in large part by the experience of finally speaking up after years of quiet discomfort, determined to ensure Brookhaven never again concentrated that much unchecked power in a single person. Gloria continued hosting her informal coffee gatherings near the mailboxes, though the conversations there shifted noticeably over time, from anxious whispers about Karen's latest find toward genuine, comfortable neighborhood small talk, the kind that only exists in a truly settled community. I sometimes wondered, in quieter, reflective moments, what might have happened had I simply paid that first bogus fine quietly and moved on, the way so many families before mine apparently had. And I always arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion: nothing would have changed. Karen's downfall, when I really examined it honestly, wasn't caused by any single dramatic confrontation, but by the patient accumulation of documented truth, each small piece meaningless alone, devastating once properly assembled and presented at precisely the right, unavoidable moment. The clubhouse itself underwent renovation the following year, ironically using funds partially recovered from Karen's restitution payments. A small, symbolic irony that Frank found particularly satisfying whenever he mentioned it. Watching new landscaping grow in where Karen's fraudulent invoices once quietly bled the community dry. Brookhaven Estates. 3 years after that humiliating afternoon over a simple parking pass request, functions today as something considerably closer to the peaceful, fair community I'd originally hoped to raise my family within. Transparent, accountable, and finally free of quiet, unchecked institutional cruelty. Dana and I still live in the same house on Sycamore Lane, though the neighborhood around us feels genuinely different now. Lighter somehow, freed from the low, constant hum of anxiety that had apparently defined daily life there for considerably longer than I'd initially realized. Elijah, now finishing high school, has expressed interest in studying law, citing this entire experience, somewhat to my surprise, as the moment he first understood how patient, careful documentation could ultimately dismantle even the most entrenched, seemingly untouchable forms of institutional power. I think often about that first afternoon at the clubhouse counter. Brittany's mocking laughter, Karen's casual cruelty over something as simple as admiring a car's engineering. And I recognize now how close I came to simply absorbing that humiliation quietly and moving on with my life. Instead, that single humiliating encounter became the quiet spark for something considerably larger than either Karen or I could have anticipated that day. A reckoning 11 years overdue, finally delivered not through anger, but through patient, methodical, undeniable documentation. Renee still calls occasionally, updating me on other HOA discrimination cases her new firm handles, several explicitly modeled on the documentation framework we developed together, a quiet legacy neither of us had set out intentionally to build, but one I've come to value deeply nonetheless. Karen Whitfield, once the undisputed, feared authority over every fence height and mailbox color at Brookhaven Estates, now lives quietly 2 counties away, permanently barred from ever again holding HOA leadership anywhere in Ohio. Her name a lasting cautionary footnote in the community's history. The financial restitution she paid restored Brookhaven's reserve fund completely, funding new playground equipment, updated clubhouse facilities, and a permanent independent audit requirement written directly into the association's revised bylaws, ensuring no future leader could quietly drain community resources undetected again. Brittany, wherever she ultimately landed professionally, at least avoided criminal prosecution through her eventual cooperation. Though Priya mentioned she'd heard secondhand that Brittany rarely discusses her years at Brookhaven's clubhouse with anyone from her new life at all. Susan's steady, transparent leadership over the following years earned Brookhaven a genuinely different reputation throughout the region. No longer whispered about as the neighborhood run by an intimidating tyrant, but occasionally cited as a model for effective, accountable community governance done properly. I still keep that original master document Renee and I built together, archived carefully, a reminder of exactly how much patient, careful attention it took to finally hold unchecked institutional power accountable within a community that had quietly tolerated it for far too long. Dana jokes sometimes that I should frame the original bogus truck parking violation notice, the very first fine that started my quiet investigation, hanging it somewhere visible as a reminder of how something so small and petty eventually unraveled something so much larger and more consequential. Every so often, a new family moves into Brookhaven, and someone inevitably mentions the story during a casual welcome conversation. The humiliating afternoon over a parking pass, the mocked interest in a luxury car, and the slow, patient, 11-year reckoning that finally followed it. I never set out to become the person who exposed Karen Whitfield's fraud and discrimination. I only wanted a parking pass for my brother's visit, treated with the same basic dignity every other homeowner in that clubhouse lobby had always simply taken for granted. What started as mockery over a Bentley I never even owned ended, 3 years later, with restitution paid, bylaws rewritten, a community transformed, and a woman who once ruled Brookhaven Estates through fear now permanently barred from ever wielding that kind of unchecked power again. Brookhaven Estates stands today as proof that patient documentation, quiet coalition building, and simple, Stubborn refusal to disappear quietly can eventually dismantle even the most entrenched institutional cruelty. One calmly recorded phone call, one honest witness, one undeniable fact at a time.